Gary Sainer is, well, he's a long, let's see, I guess we met maybe in 2014.
I think it was, yeah.
He's been one of my go-tos for a long time, and we talked a lot about UDI. And I know you do other things, but like I just have UDI Gary Sainer in my brain. Tell the kind folks at home what besides UDI you specialize in.
Well, for medical devices, we're aware of some of those steps that manufacturers need to go through to have approval. But you're nailed it, Joe. Our focus here at RETEC is to help manufacturers comply with UDI requirements in the U.S. And now we'll talk a little bit later about it's kind of spread around the world like the pandemic, and many other health authorities are now integrating medical device registration along with UDI attributes. So in the US, it's kind of it's a layered on responsibility. And I think, Joe, you had talked about maybe in the future, we could kind of repeat this for a conversation in Europe, but now you will see that the device registration and UDI is kind of linked together. So that's,
I do, before you do that, when we talked, said that you really had two presentations out of this. I kind of put a placeholder as Gary is coming back, but what will be the difference?
Yeah, so when we jump to outside the US, and you and I talked focusing on Europe, but the conversation continues to South Korea, China, Australia, and so on. We find that there's nuances when you jump into these different health authorities. They all use the same UDI, they spell it the same, it's simply UDI, but guess what? It's not so simple when you get to these different health authorities, because each one kind of has their own set of rules and policy. It kind of sounds the same, but when you read it, it's different. Same way with the device attributes that need to be reported. They look like they're the same list or very close, but we find very few fields are able to actually be shared. And there's many health authorities, have this, I'm going to do it myself mentality, and to come up with a custom list of policy and requirements. But we'll get into those weeds next time, but it is a different discussion.
I'll also say before you start that I have a number of regulatory and quality folks on this call, and you're the only one who's ever used that acronym with me. I've never heard Team Michelle talk to me about UDI. I've never heard Karen Deep mention it. David, so if it weren't for you, I'd be pretty oblivious to the whole thing. Yeah,
it's as you know, there's tons of acronyms in our industry here. And unique device identification is this layered on responsibility the FDA put in place. I work with it every day, so I slip into this UDI acronym, but I always do mean unique device identification.
Well, the point I'm making is I haven't heard any other manufacturer or any other consultant or anyone even talk about it. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't even, as a reasonably educated person in the.
Are you talking about the term UDI?
I am.
Okay, then you haven't been listening.
I haven't been listening. Your conversations and mine have been MDR and quality management systems, and
well, it's an auxiliary service that we support for our clients, because everybody has to do it, but they have to do other things like quality management systems and submissions to the FDA and EU, and all of that is a subset.
Yeah.
All right.
So yeah, I know, Michelle, you're out there doing
She's out there
information and incorporating it. So pick up the phone, talk to Michelle for a while, and UDI will come up very soon.
All right, Gary, I'll be quiet. Gary Sainer, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, let's walk our way through what this UDI is. And many manufacturers are first hit with this topic when they look at the United States, the FDA requirements. And just as a real quick recap, for those that are not in this particular space and deal with it every day, I'm just going to set the stage here, going back in time and looking at what the FDA put in place as to why they are rolling out this initiative. And, what are the goals? And bottom line, I'm not going to go through these bullets, but many of you probably have already seen this if you come up with the UDI discussion. But basically, they wanted to prove safety, and there was not a way to very precisely identify products. Unlike the pharmaceutical industry, by the way, pharmaceutical industry, we all are familiar with this National Drug Code, NDC, which uniquely defines a particular drug manufacturer, a product, a strength, and in packaging. So it's very granular, and you can do a lot of precise data mining with that. CDRH did not have that standard in place, so they went ahead and, along with other health authorities around the world, put some guidelines in place for unique device identification. And then the FDA was first to roll out the actual requirements and put a deadline in place. And it was kind of layered, well, it was layered on top of device registration and product listing. So it's kind of what it is, and it's a separate database, a separate post-approval process. But one of those checkbox, and Joe, you do a great job of helping small and emerging medical device manufacturers go through the hoops of bringing product to market. And many, at times, they forget that the very last item before they need to roll out the product is to have UDI in place and report the information, make sure UDI is on the product. So it is one of those check boxes when you finally introduce the product to the marketplace. This is the obligatory definition.
You're sharing your screen. We're not seeing it, Gary.
Oh dear. So yeah, I need to turn that on because it looked really good on my side. There we go. Did that come through?
It does, and it is very nice.
All right, so we talked about this being, this is actually coming from the FDA, but you'll see a similar list when you go to the European Commission, over to South Korea, China, and so on. They kind of all plagiarize some of the goals and initiative that the FDA had in place. So moving on to some of the actual definition, two parts. There's this mandatory part, which is called the device identifier, and it points to a particular manufacturer's company and a product all the way down to a particular model or version. So if you create a new version, you create some new features, and now you call it a new version, you'll have to create a new device identifier. And that's always required to be part of the unique device identification. There's a second conditional part, and these are what is referred to as production controls. So if you do identify your product with a manufacturing date, expiration date, lot, or a serial number, and it's on the label, then the guidelines indicate that you must include those particular attributes and those values into the UDI. So if you simply concatenate these together, there's a device identifier and a production identifier. And I'm using GS1. It's a very frequently used standard. For illustration purposes, this first number in red in the bottom left happens to identify Read Tech. Read Tech is, we don't manufacture any devices, but we subscribe to this process with GS1 just to feel the pain that manufacturers go through. And then this parentheses 01 is a code for computers and interpretation of that data that says this is a device identifier following this code. And then the second half can be quite long. If you had all those controls, it gets to be rather lengthy. And again, there's codes like this 11, 17, 10, and 21 in parentheses that tell those that are interpreting this information about the values that follow. So it can be quite long. Now, the other question we get is, what do I have to do to comply? And we put it into 4 different quadrants. The first has to do with putting that UDI value that we talked about on the device itself, on the label, and also package labels. And it has to be presented in both human readable and also something called the automatic data capture, automatic ID and data capture, AIDC. So typically that is implemented as a 1-dimensional or a 2-dimensional barcode. And we see this actually very frequently. Outside the medical device world, we see it. We go to retail, buy clothes, groceries, whatever. There is a UPC symbol on that. That actually is an example of this AIDC technology. And then there was a requirement that date form had to follow a particular style. So the first major requirement is identify the actual product and put UDI on the label. There is a subset of medical devices, and if you fall into this category, then you have to make sure the UDI is permanently attached to that product. And many companies will either laser etch this or chemically etch the identification on the product. There's ways to use a very durable label and satisfy this requirement. But the criteria is that if you use it on different patients, so maybe it's a scalpel, and let's think about it. Let's say Joe goes into the surgery room, they use the scalpel, and 2 weeks later, I show up for surgery, and they use the very same scalpel. So now that's on 2 different patients. And the other criteria is that in between those 2 surgeries, there's high level of disinfection or sterilization. So many times there's on-site sterilization at a hospital. It would run this particular scalpel through the sterilization process and then have it ready for the next surgery. And I show up and nice and clean. I'm the second patient. Now, that particular medical device would then qualify and must have to have a direct mark on it. The third quadrant is reporting information to a database. So this is different than the FURLs, the database where companies go online and register their product and list, or excuse me, register their establishment and list their product. This is a separate, totally separate database. There's over 3.5 million records in this database as of right now. Yeah, it looks like someone has their mic turned on. Maybe you could mute. ×2. Yeah. Okay. So this information is also made public at this link. You can follow that too, or search it on Google. Access Good ID. There is the last and fourth quadrant. It has to deal with some of the documentation regarding this particular activity. And this is kind of forgotten. It's not talked about too much, where there are a number of documents that might be in your quality management system, but there's various touch points where you now have to reference UDI if it's available. So annual reports, a design history record, in some cases your design history file, complaints. If a complaint comes in and has a reference to a UDI, then you need to log that. If you're reporting an adverse event under the MDR, then obviously you need to include UDI. So there's other requirements if you're submitting electronically. There's the 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records that need to be complied. And then there's this one little clause, not too many people talk about it, but there is this maintenance over the course of time. So when you do pull a product off the market, you do have to update this database and say that there's a discontinuation date and put that in place. And then maintain those records 3 additional years. So there's some items in this quadrant. We won't go into all the details, but there's 4 basic areas to comply. This is the other question that we get. How do I put UDI on my product label? And many companies are already doing this. If you have some of the products that fall under the higher risk, like class 3 or class 2, you should have already figured this out years ago. We get some companies that only manufacture class 1s, so they're actually seeing this topic for the first time. And I would believe anyone that is involved with UDI, they see these different waves of manufacturers that they come on to the compliance states that are applicable to their portfolio. So a class 1 product, they have a lot of questions, and it's coming up here in September, so a couple months away, that they would now have to comply. And each of these different manufacturers, these groups of manufacturers, they work their way through the same learning curve. And there's repeat education for each one of these groups. But the question about how do I put this on the label, we talked about that device identifier in red that's always there. And then if some of these production identifiers, and I put the example of all 4 illustrations. So there is a lot number, serial number, there is an expiration date, and up here on above the barcode is this manufacturing date. So all 4 of those particular controls are on my label. Therefore, they're embedded in this string of values. And there might only be 3, 2, 1, and it's possible that you don't have any of those controls. So this whole section would be omitted and you would only have a device identifier. So the other question we get is, and we kind of touched on this in our earlier discussion, Joe, where the US rolled it out first, this requirement for UDI. And then we have seen, as time marched on, Europe, South Korea, China, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia had recently delayed, but looks like they're getting very close. And next September, they'll have some requirements. And then there's this second wave that I refer to as those that are planning very seriously. Some of these have made some very good progress. Now highlight Australia, by the way. They are really cruising. One of the fastest developments I've seen. They are really putting some things together. They already have what they call a sand pit. So appropriate for Australia, I guess. It's their sand pit environment where you can go and start testing some of the data. All right, so we kind of just did a background. I just want to cover that to make sure those that are new to UDI, those that work with UDI very frequently, this is probably a repeat. What we'd like to move into now, though, is the particular requirements and exceptions and some extensions that are applicable to just the Class 1 product.
I'll interject here, Gary, just inviting folks to not be shy and ask a question. Typically, we have a very interactive hour here. This is more of a presentation, which I respect. I'm not sure that everyone on the call who needs to be familiar with UDI is. So if anyone does, we are family. There's no question that we can't talk about here.
I have a quick question.
Okay, great.
This is Ty Benson.
Ty Benson.
Mostly it's about what you're going to cover next. So has this presentation been updated for the UDI guidance document that was released last week, July 22nd?
That is a great question. And I don't know how Joe did this, but he scheduled this event.
You scheduled it.
Well, I lucked out. I had no clue that this was going to happen. But literally, Joe, last week, and that's what this question is about, the FDA came out and reshuffled the timeline, reshuffled the requirements for Class 1. And we will talk about that to answer your question.
Okay.
So, you want to have a job, right?
Yeah.
They wouldn't need you.
It happens to be one of the things that we just keep an eye on, literally day in and day out. And we were looking at this draft guidance, and we'll get into the weeds here, but yeah, there was a lot of confusion. Anyway, I have a couple comments on that, but and I would actually like your comments as to whether you thought the FDA was timely, but anyway, we'll talk.
Oh, you mean by their 75-day extension? Because I knew they weren't.
Yeah.
Like.
All right. Well, I'm going to go back to you to get your comment later. But anyone else, please jump in, or if you have more questions, just raise your hand. Joe, if you don't mind, keep an eye on that. I have my eye elsewhere here.
I got you.
Okay, cool. Now, I revisited this slide. We already talked about this, but these are the 4 quadrants. But when you come to Class 1, you folks know, dealing with the FDA, there's tons of little clauses, little guidances here and there. There's exceptions all over the place. And this is no different. You see all these different exceptions pop up, and we need to talk about those because these are ones that are applicable only to Class 1. And if you have been working with Class 3s and 2s, this is quite different. So we're going to work our way through. I put those particular exceptions in a chart, and we're going to work our way, top to bottom here on this chart. So the very first one has to do with some Class 1 products have something called a good manufacturing practice exemption. And you're able to find that information by going to the product code database. So that you can search FDA classification code, and you get a real nice presentation there of the various aspects. Now, this happens to be for a mechanical walker. I'm not quite there yet, but after surgery, I've used this, so I know what this is exactly. And it has a product code of an ITJ, and you work your way down here. You got a lot of information, submission type, it's 510K exempt, very good. There's a regulation number for this particular Class 1, and confirming here that is in fact Class 1. But the bottom of this particular screenshot, I show something called good manufacturing practice exempt. Yes, that is very significant. Roughly, off the top of my head, about 25% of all your class 1 products are good manufacturing practice exempt, meaning they're very low risk. And the FDA is not requiring any UDI on these particular products. So when you look at your portfolio, if you make mechanical walkers, the good news is you don't have to comply with UDI at all. And so you can search through and find that information. Now, don't be confused. Good manufacturing practice exempt is not the same thing as 510K exempt. About 95% of all class 1 product codes are 510K exempt, but only a few are good manufacturing practice exempt. So, there's something, go ahead.
Gary, we have a customer that has got some class 1s that are non-exempt and
I'm sorry, you broke off there, that are non-exempt?
Yeah, we have a customer that has some class 1s that are not exempt and some that are class 1 and GMP exempt. So we basically have both in the same manufacturing line. Now, I don't know what Michelle's question was, but that's the background.
Yeah. No, that's definitely this particular criteria for not having UDI points only to GMP exemption. So it really doesn't matter for this exemption, whether it's 510K exempt or not. If it's GMP exempt, then you can claim this exception. Good practice is that you note that in your design history file, that you actually check that out. And that's why you don't have UDI on your product. I will talk, and maybe this is the point to talk about.
I fell off. I fell off. Did my question get all the way out before my internet quit?
No, ma'am.
It did not.
Okay. So what I was saying is that we have a client that has got they've got all their products are class 1. Some are exempt and GMP exempt and some are not. And they are adamant that they want to put the exempt products in the UDI database as well as the non-exempt products. And so my question is first off, does the UDI database accept things that aren't supposed to be in there? And then secondly, what would be the purpose or logic long-term of going ahead and putting everything in there and going through this extra rigor and maintaining things and records?
Yeah, that's a really good aspect of this. And that's a great segue into what I was going to mention. As a business decision, you can go ahead and apply UDI to your product and basically comply with UDI. You can put it on your product. And you can also submit it to the FDA Good ID database. So they do allow voluntary submissions, to answer your first question. The second part, what are the advantages? Let me just give you an example of this mechanical walker. If you go to the FDA Good ID database, you will see there's about 100 records right now that include mechanical walkers. Why in the world would you do that? It's extra effort, time, cost. One of the reasons is that this information is used by many downstream parties. There's data aggregators that take this information and sometimes they resell it into decision support systems. If you go to the doctor, and nowadays, they don't pull out a paper file. My doctor pulls out a tablet and electronically has my health record there. And if I had a splint or I had a CPAP machine or something, they know that. All that information is embedded into that electronic history record. So being able to be visible in this downstream market is one of the reasons people will go ahead and go through the effort to submit voluntarily into the Good ID. So there's two benefits there. One is you're visible to those companies that need that information. Hospitals are many times in shortage. We hear frequently about medical device being short supply. Let's talk about these masks that have, everybody's wearing masks for a period of time and short supply, right? So if we talk about that in general, if there's a shortage for a particular medical device, a lot of companies will, or downstream buyers will look to see what are my options? Where do I see these? So if you're not even in the database, and not in these data aggregations and downstream use, you're not even being viewed as a potential purchase. So you're not considered as an alternative in the event of a shortage. Hospitals are also very cost conscious. So they will look as to see what is available and then find that particular alternative, say, oh, I see a mechanical walker here from Hage Incorporated. And hey, I'm going to check the price out. Looks like it's a good price. I used to buy walkers from Saner Incorporated, but now I'm buying from Hage Incorporated. But if you're not in the good ID, you're not on the list. People don't even know about you if they're using that as their conduit. Now, I understand there's many other advertising and marketing venues,
Gary,
but
may I add
keep
something
in
to
mind.
that?
Yeah.
Gary, right now, if you put your barcode reader from your cell phone to an UDI, usually nothing comes up until you use a special reader. But there are a few fields in the GUDIT that could be very handy, where you can put a URL to either a manual or an instruction video, whatever, and that can be really helpful for your product. And that those fields are not mandatory, so a lot of people just skip them, but they can be very useful in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually downloaded an app, and there are some apps out there that are available. They're free, so you can use a barcode app to identify this particular information, and then link it back to the FDA's good ID and receive data. So you're absolutely right. My wife actually was in the hospital recently, and I live and breathe UDI, so I'm actually going through the hospital bed, the IV pump, checking for UDIs. Like, okay, is it here? Is it here? Oh yeah, look, it's there. So I didn't, but I have in the past used my phone to actually read that UDI. So you bring up a real good point. That pushes this out to the actual patients and a whole nother level of users of being able to have quick access. Now, that was the intent of the FDA making the database public. So if you know about it, you can go to that website and search. But you bring on a really good point where once this starts to become very prevalent, you can download some apps if you know where to go, but hopefully that becomes much more common. And then, you could jump to that particular database and get a lot more info. So yeah, really good point.
For the moment, I've suspended your screen because now we have Sue and Alyssa and David Chadwick is joining us, all of whom have something to contribute. So let's just hear what they have to say. Alyssa, you were first.
So following up on Luke's comment, there is a new product on the market that was developed by Ochsner Health, and I sent it to you, Joe, via LinkedIn. What it does is based off of maybe a QR code or the UPC code. It can pull up the surgical technique intraoperatively onto a screen. So the surgeon, if the surgeon has any questions, let's say it's their first few times that they're doing the case, they can actually see the surgical technique on the screen, whereas before they relied on the rep, if the rep was in the room, to provide feedback. And I think it will be really helpful in very complex cases, in new cases, because you can't remember in, like, let's say a revision spine surgery, or total knee revision, the 23 trays that you bring in, you can't remember all of the instrumentation a lot of times.
Yeah, very good. Yep, that's cool.
Sue?
My device is called Frog Filter Removal of Glass. It's for ampule-based medication, and
it's small.
It's small. So we developed a QR code, and it's basically an animated video playing Star Wars type music, no sound, no verbiage, so it can be used in any country. And it just shows you that simple, we slowed down part of an animated video for about 10 seconds, just showing you how you withdraw the fluid, remove the outer cover, and inject. And so it's explaining and it improves the process, so the healthcare provider will know not to pull the cap off first before they inject it into the vial.
Yeah, I think that is, as this data becomes available, we're seeing a lot more means to expose it to patients, to healthcare providers. And I think that's only going to get better. and probably will accelerate pretty fast. All right, was there another question?
Well, I just see the QR code being the norm in the future.
Yeah, but I will mention, according to GS1, for the dimensional barcode, the two-dimensional barcode, GS1 has a standard called GS1 data matrix. So I will comment that they only allow that particular two-dimensional barcode if you're using GS1. But I have seen QR codes, for example, being used in South Korea as very common type of symbology. But and I'm not saying that's wrong to use QR codes, but right now it does not satisfy the requirements for UDI. Maybe there'll be some relaxation in the future by some of these standards, but if you happen to be using GS1, there's a particular symbology called GS1 data matrix, which is different than a QR code. Just a quick technology note there.
David Chadwick is joining us for the first time. David, would you introduce yourself and then share your thoughts?
Sure. I'm David Chadwick. I've been doing this regulatory world for most of my life. It feels like I did. And I peripherally see UDI. I have not, been the administrator of it, but just to think about one of the early slides from Paul, I think, no, not Paul, from Gary, sorry. You don't need a UDI on some Class 1 exempt products. What's the purpose of a UDI? I was always of the impression that a big purpose was to identify manufacturer, lot numbers, different items that would help in a recall, that would help a physician, that if we can tie a user manual to it, that gets lost to the end user who might need it. And I understand these are Class 1, these examples, and then someone else mentioned we've created a QR code you can put on the label. If I walk downstairs to my labeling group and said, give me some real estate on that label, after they shoot me, they'll probably hang me. If you make a catheter, if you make something small, you don't have any real estate on labeling even. On a MRI machine, you have 2 tons of real estate on labels. But just some open questions, really, like basic one is, what is the real purpose of UDI if not to provide manufacturer and individual unit or lot information?
David, for context, would you share with us where you work? What you work
sorry. I work at Cook Medical, global company. I'm in Bloomington, Indiana. We make.
We know we're fans of John Eckberg.
Product everywhere across the spectrum of
Eckberg?
Life and health. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But to help answer that, we talked briefly about some of these goals that the FDA has.
Oh, sorry. I was having computer trouble downstairs. Sorry.
Oh, so we talked about some of the issues that the FDA sees. They want to reduce medical errors. They want to be able to granularly identify a product for the life of the product. And there were situations where Medtronic and Johnson & Johnson and all these others would have identifiers on particular products according to their own proprietary part numbering scheme. And actually there was numbers that would point to 2 different things. Now, this is a gross example. I don't know what the exact example was, but you could have a part number that points to a medical bed and another part number that points to a Band-Aid. And that's the way industry was. And the FDA said, no, we want a uniform identifier on all medical devices. And now you talk about Class 1s. Not all Class 1s are exempt. By default, I've heard Jay Crowley from the FDA say, assume your medical device has to have UDI on it until you find an exception. So the default position is you need to identify your products. I have talked to hundreds of manufacturers that struggle with the real estate. I understand that is a serious problem. And sometimes they go all kinds of hoops to try to put a barcode on their product. I mentioned a 2-dimensional barcode because it's a lot smaller. It takes up less real estate. And a lot of companies use this particular requirement now to switch over to a 2-dimensional barcode. So I don't know if that helps you understand some of the direction here, but it also provides very accurate data mining capability.
I agree. Gary. Sorry. And and you said the FDA wants this on all medical products, but then we carve out these exemptions. So as a end user consumer or my mother, you know, to talk about a walker maybe,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can't help her to figure out who made it. I can't help her to figure out what's wrong with it. And I can't even communicate back to our own government to see who made this particular one, you know, because the system falls apart.
I totally agree. And I think it goes against the main idea that we have on the screen here. If you carve out various, 25% basically of the product codes for class 1 can claim this, I think personally it's a bad business decision to go ahead and make use of that exemption. It's probably a better idea to voluntarily submit. It's good for your product visibility in the space. And, ultimately we want customers to have a great experience with our products. So one of the ways to do that is to go ahead and voluntarily submit the data and apply with UDI. So I think we're on the same page there.
Oh, no, we are.
Yeah.
I mean, over my career, I've submitted or advised submitting a 510K exempt product just to get the FDA's tracking number and the power that letter, the clearance letter, brings to my marketing teams. So, and I think Sue maybe made a comment, we have, exempt class 1s and non-exempt. So I presume if it was Sue, I don't know exactly, I don't remember. They've entered half of them into the database for UDI.
Yeah.
And they label, half of their products with the UDI. And why don't we all go further?
Yeah, I think, well, they do allow this voluntary exception. But unless there's another question, I'm going to step to the second area on class 1s.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
And Gary, do you have a hard stop at the top of the hour or no? We don't this exactly to an hour. We go as long as, but if you need to stop in 60 minutes to that.
I'm going to do a quick checker. I think it's.
Well, my question is very quick. If you don't mind, as a layperson, my business is supply chain and I help medical device products get assembled and distributed. But I meet a lot of startup companies or people that are launching a medical device. The question to you is, when should they be? Because, I like part of my approach or sales approach or relationship that I build is, hey, I'm the guy that knows a guy, right? Have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Do you know Joe, right? That's what I always ask them. But when in the development cycle should they be thinking of this? Because how long does it take to get approvals and things from the FDA?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We get that periodically. At the time that you design your label, and whether it be a PMA or 510K, there's some submission of a draft label. I highly recommend that you at least reserve space on that label for the UDI. You don't have to come up with the exact value, but reserve space so that it's in the early design work. So this is.
So would that be before the 510K? Submission? They should already be thinking about that. Okay, because I don't know the details. I know the 510K is a big threshold, right? It's like, have you applied? Have you got approvals? Things like that.
Yeah. Now I will say that's a good practice to do that. There is a requirement that before you go to the marketplace, before you commercially distribute, now you start selling products, you ship it out your back door. Before that event happens, you have to have UDI on the product label, and you also have had to record that information to the FDA Good ID database. So
now one quick question, but not for you. Michelle, is this something that you address when you work with a client with all that paperwork, FDA stuff?
Yes. So we plan for it right from the very beginning. And like Gary said, we turn in draft labeling in our 510Ks that have got placeholders for the UDI. And we've been doing that for years.
Okay, so I can put that in that bucket and say, hey, these are all the things you need to do. Go talk to Michelle, and then you'll make sure everything happens.
Yep.
Okay, awesome.
Thanks, guys. Very good.
So now I just have a comment, just a fun fact for the crowd. He mentioned Jay Crowley from the FDA, who's the guy who came up with all of this. I'd just like to say he spent about 20 years getting this passed as regulation. And then he immediately retired and went into consulting.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Gary,
has a good question in the chat.
Excuse me, I sense a tension for you, Gary, that you really want to get through the presentation, and there are more questions too. So 2 things. 1, everyone breathe. 2nd, you're going to be back in as early as 2 weeks. I don't have anyone for the 12th, or we could do the 19th. You let us know.
Okay.
And if you feel you anticipate the other 2 comments that are coming, and let me just get through a slide or 2, we can do that, or we'll just have free play here and people will ask what's most pressing on their minds. Do you have a preference?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't have a hard stop, so we can go a little bit longer today. I'm certainly glad to do that. I think it's all a question about software specific versioning. And let me knock that one out right now.
So that was you.
I'm sorry?
Was that you, Rains, your question?
It was, yep.
You want to give any color to it beyond what you typed? You're welcome to.
Yeah, I would say, so most software teams use a major minor patch versioning scheme. When versions change, that's to be updated in Good ID. But I did notice in Good ID, some teams just use major minor. It would seem pretty burdensome to have to update with patch versioning changes. What's a best practice, versioning scheme software teams can use to, work within the framework?
Yeah, there is various levels of changes in software, and the FDA puts the burden of that decision back on you, the manufacturer. As a general rule, any software that you would term as a new version or new model would have to have a new device identifier. So a lot of comments and direction guidance along that line say it's a major change to the user interface, or it's a major functional change, new capability. There might be implications to the database structure on that software, a significant change to the algorithm, the way things work. So if you call that a new version, a major version, then you fall into this category of creating a new device identifier. That said, there are many other changes that you would roll out. There are bug fixes. There might be a little enhancement. There might be a color change. There might be, a minor feature being added. I throw those into the minor category. And if you decide that that is not significant enough to be a major change, then you can keep the very same device identifier. And you do have a couple options. One is you could use one of those production controls that we talked about. You could create a new serial number, capture that information in one of those particular production identifiers. GS1 actually has another production identifier just for software version, so you could actually capture that a little bit outside the FDA's responsibility. But then even if you don't put the change into that production identifier, you can still obviously note that in the description of your product, in the about screen that pops up and so on, that this is a particular build version and it's minor. So unfortunately, it's a fuzzy answer. Is it a very significant major change? Definitely a new device identifier. If it's minor, then you have this option, not to make a device identifier change, keep it, and it makes sense, business sense, to capture that in some fashion, either in one of those production controls or through a different part number or a different build number. Does that make sense?
I think so. So, a team should take away from that. Maybe it's not a good practice to use a major minor patch in Good ID, because I see some software that, has it to that degree. It sounds like you'd recommend just have a major versioning there, capture the rest in a production identifier, or maybe major or minor version.
Yeah. And I would concur with that. It allows you to keep control of those minor builds and those minor changes, those little bug fixes, and not have to go back to the FDA and do an update. And you're still meeting, the intent of what UDI is all about. It's just that, and the same is true in mechanical design, by the way. So if you have a mechanical feature change or a different way of doing a particular procedure, or maybe there's a slight material change, and as long as you don't call it a major you don't call it a major change or a different model, then you don't have to change the device identifier. But again, it's good practice to put maybe some kind of a lot number or a batch number, manufacturing date, or some other comment. Maybe you actually use a different part number for that minor mechanical change, but keep track of it so that you can, do business properly. But consider the value of keeping the same device identifier, or the value of changing your device identifier. For example, if now that new little feature that you added that you thought was going to be innocent is now connected with a huge amount of defects and complaints, and now you have to run a recall. It's
So
so
Gary-
much it's so much easier to identify that recall with that new device identifier that captures only that, that blue color where you used to have red. Anyway, go ahead. I think there was a comment.
Yeah, there was, Gary, before you get too far beyond it, on mechanical changes, is backward compatibility of a mechanical change the only real requirement? It sounds like even if it is backward compatible with the old assembly and or part, there's still an implication that if there is a major functionality change or a significant improvement, that you should consider a new number. Is that correct?
Yeah, and let's use the FDA words. Is it a new model or version? And then they let you decide what that is. So they do talk about the functionality, the safety, the performance, your intent of use. If all those things are changed with that new enhancement, then you definitely ought to consider putting a new DI in there. But it's a nebulous. The FDA did not get into the details, and I understand why, about what would constitute a particular change for all the different technologies out there. It would be a can of worms. So they leave it up to the manufacturer. You know your product best. You know the safety, the effectiveness, and if there's a significant change, yeah, you call it a new model and version. You want to separate that out, and you want to identify that. In some cases, you want to market that, or you might actually price it differently. All good reasons to have a new device identifier.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. So we were one of four through this little list. I'm going to, Joe, if you're okay with this, I'm going to quickly hit 2 and 3 and then finish up with this third one. And then we're going to, extend the conversation a little bit today. And then we'll pick up next time if there's any catch up on the FDA topics, and then talk about Europe and others on the next meeting. Are you good with that?
I certainly am. And if you're able to, with one eye, take a look at your calendar and commit to a Friday, these are the people who are most likely to want to put it on their calendar. So if you can before we leave, and yes, please go ahead with this slide 10.
Okay, cool. All right. So we talked about the good manufacturing practice exempt, no to UI, and the benefits. Yeah, you save some cost. And the disadvantage of not doing this, you don't become visible. It's not good for the patient crowd, whatever. Now, there's another group that in this particular exception goes across the board, all class 1 devices. And this is very simple. That's why I wanted to knock it out right away. You don't have to include that production identifier. So now that becomes optional. So by regulation, a class 1 only has to have this first component, the device identifier. And all of these become a business decision, whether or not you want to include them. You're able to, but it's not required for class 1 devices across the board. Now, many of your class 1 devices have a UPC. So this is the universal product code. It's actually a GS1 standard. And if you sell in retail in North America, I almost guarantee you have a UPC on your product. The good news is that it's short, it's long-standing. You're probably using it for 5-10 years, and the FDA accepts that as a UDI for this class 1 product. You don't have to put that longer string that I had in place. So the takeaway here is this is a UPC. You don't have to have any production identifiers. It actually doesn't support any production identifiers, but it's nice, short, and sweet. And I would say a good portion of your legacy products already have that if you're selling into retail. One other quick comment, make sure you have the full date format in place. Some companies had previously left off the day, but that's now a requirement. All right, so let's knock out this last one. This is the one that there was some previous conversation about. Last week, the FDA made public a final guidance for industry. This was a final version of a draft guidance that came out in October of last year. And it basically says that if you are 510K exempt and you're a consumer health product, and we'll take a look at what that really means, then you do not have to submit data to the database, this global UDI database, Good ID. And the draft guidance stood there October, November, December. The comment period ended the end of December, January, February, and it left industry pending. They didn't know if this was going to be legally binding or not. So the draft guidance, as you know, technically is out there for comment only. It's non-binding. Companies could not actually depend on this exception. And time was rolling on. Finally, last week, the FDA rolled out this final guidance. And in doing so, they said, this is for sure, this is our current thinking, you can count on this. And if you meet the criteria, then you don't have to submit to the good ID. And then, by the way, and reading between the lines, we realize we're a little bit late in telling you about this. So we're going to extend the deadline 75 days to December 8th of this year. So let's go into those details. Normally, let's understand what this means. Normally, these are the data fields that would be reported to the FDA Good ID. So there's 57 that are actually submitted by the labeler. The FDA looks up some codes and they derive a couple more, about 7, and there's a grand total of 64 that are able to be in this database. The ones in red are required. So there's some that you have to look at and determine whether or not you need to fill them in conditionally. I drew lines, so I struck out some of the ones that for class 1 purposes, they're not normally used. So, these are most likely null values. But anyway, this is the data set that would normally be submitted. And if you qualify, then you don't have to submit this particular record. So here's the link. The guidance is actually dated earlier this week. And I don't know how I lucked out scheduling this particular event, Joe. I said this Friday and doggone it, it was issued last week, officially published the 25th. Follow the link and it talks about the criteria. So let's just quickly capitalize or highlight those. It has to be 510K exempt. And that's a pretty easy criteria to meet. Well over 90% of all class 1 products are 510K exempt. So not too hard meeting that criteria. But now this is the second one. If you sell your class 1 products directly to consumers in this over-the-counter market. So I can go to Walgreens, some of the pharmacies out there, Rite Aid. I could go to Walmart. I could go to Amazon. And as a consumer, I can actually buy your product. So it's sold over the counter. Now, if you meet that criteria, then you don't have to submit that particular record. I won't repeat, but point out what we talked about earlier. You can still voluntarily submit that record to the Good ID, enjoy the visibility, and hopefully enhance your business presence and your product presence to those downstream users by going ahead and voluntarily doing that. So this now becomes a business decision. It's not a regulatory decision anymore. It's a business decision. Do I want that record in place? Especially if some of my competitors are already doing it, do I want to be omitted? So you have to make that decision. There's not a good or bad answer here. That's a business decision for you. Now there's some information that came with this draft guidance, and they tried to clarify particular class 1 devices that cannot claim this exemption, that in fact do have to make submissions. So, they talk about some bullets down here, and I don't know if we have time, but I'll just quickly highlight a couple of them. Those that are 510K required cannot claim this exemption. Those that are prescription and with other restrictions placed on them.
Gary, quickly on the prescription, would that be dictated in the regulation for that device, or is that something like at the manufacturer's discretion if they determine that this is a prescription only device? How does one make that determination?
It's my understanding this falls completely on the manufacturer side, whether you sell this over the counter, whether you sell it through a prescription. So if you go to a particular product code and read the information about that product code, there's no reference in there that says this is prescription or over the counter. You don't find that. Sometimes in the description in the regulation, there's mention of how it's being distributed, to consumers or only. So you might start to get a hint about that. I would imagine that, this ultimately falls to the manufacturer to make this determination. Now, we don't have time to talk about it, but this other restriction, I'll just highlight this. There's some restrictions such as an impact resistant drop test for glasses. And this drop test applies to sunglasses and readers. Like I can go into, Walgreens and buy a reader with, some strength and corrective action on the lenses. Those particular glasses meet this other restriction requirement. There's a group out there called the Vision Council that understands that impact test falls into this category, and therefore they do have to report the good ID. So it's not a straightforward prescription. In some cases, actually hearing aids, these glass impact resistance, there's some other products that fall into that. But anyway, if it falls into that, then you cannot have this good ID exception claimed. And the last one I would just highlight, we'll skip over the last two because there's very few product codes that are in those two particular categories. But if you sell to a hospital or some facility, or you intend it for healthcare professional use, then it's reused, it's reprocessed in some cases. It might be intended for wound care. So as you know, FDA has, I think, dozens of legal counsel, advising them on how to write these things. And, it just comes into really detailed analysis as to whether or not you can claim this exception. But across the board, if you sell it only to over the counter and you're 510K exempt, then as a broad stroke, you could not have to have a submission to the good ID. So I'm going to summarize this section. We talked about, first of all, class 1 devices that are sold by way of a prescription, or they're sold into a hospital, or they fall into this restricted use. And some examples would be the stethoscope, the sunglasses. We talked about that. Just because they have the drop resistant test, the regulation they must meet. The dental tools, the hospital bed and so on, they have to have UDI. What this draft guidance came out and said, if you're a consumer health product and, humidifiers, eyeglass frames, your mechanical tooth or your electronic toothbrush, water pick, maybe your pill splitter, whatever, they are sold to the consumers and do not have to report it. Now, the other aspects of UDI still apply. So you still have to have UDI on the product label, very infrequently, but if direct marketing would apply, you still need to apply that. And you have to do the documentation that we talked about. This is really just an exception for the reporting of the good ID to the good ID. We get a lot of questions about those that are used in both environments. Let's say, recently I went in to the doctors and I had a flu shot and they put a Band-Aid on me. That was by a professional. I can also go to Walgreens and buy a Band-Aid, and I would put that into the cross-use category. This exception does not apply to those cross-use products. If you sell only to consumer health, to the retail, then you don't have to submit. But if you sell to both, then this cross-use, you still have to report good ID. And just to complete this panel, the one all the way on the right here now is the ones that we talked about earlier. There's really low risk devices. They have this good manufacturing practice exemption.
Gary, I have a quick question on this slide before you go on.
Good.
So this UDI for consumer health products, you can use the UPC in lieu, correct?
Absolutely correct, yes.
Okay. And then for the cross use, there's one line in this guidance document that says consumer health products are typically labeled, or not that, in addition to being sold directly to consumers, some consumer health products may be sold or used in a professional healthcare setting. And it's kind of blurry here. How do you define what, there's class 1 devices that are clearly intended to be only used in a healthcare setting, but some that go either way. When do you apply UPC for those cross uses versus a UDI?
The UPC, as I understand it, can be used when you sell it into the professional use sector, this first sector. So actually the FDA does not require or control the use of UPC. They just say it's allowable for the class 1 products. And it's really a business decision. If you sell in retail only, you'll find that grocery stores, Amazon, whatever, because of the transaction at the cash register, they want to be able to scan that using UPC standard, without a doubt. When you go and sell your products to Mayo Clinic, let's say on the hospital side, they might be happy and able to accept a UPC. On the other hand, they may require you to use a alternative identifier referred to as a G1014, which now has 14 digits instead of 12. And you're forced into, a little bit different symbology, not a UPC barcode, but now something called a GS1 128 barcode. So it really becomes your manufacturing decision, how you label your product, and your downstream users probably already have some history or precedent about using UPC or not. I had one story that I was aware of where a company switched, and this was actually a major switch. They switched from one standard to another standard, and it affected the downstream users big time, and they actually had to go out and buy readers for their downstream users to facilitate the supply chain. And it cost them millions of dollars. It was, real significant change. But the point is, make sure that your customers are able to at least have a heads up. If you elect to change your symbology, either go from one-dimensional or two-dimensional, or to go from UPC to a G1014. When you change anything on your product, at a minimum, give them, your customers a long lead time, as long as possible, and let them react, because they have sometimes technology changes to be able to use that new format. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you, Gary.
Yep. Other questions? Let's stop here. I other than the timing, which I'll just highlight here, this class 1 has had a history of extensions, and I think industry might be a little gun shy, about believing any dates from the FDA, and rightfully so. But it was originally scheduled in the 2018 timeframe for class 1s. And then the FDA saw the quality of the previously submitted data, the class 3s and class 2s, that UDI data came into the database, and industry reacted. These downstream users that we've been referring to, we think they're kind of nebulous out there, but guess what? They got the ear of FDI or the FDA and said, there's omissions in this database. There's part numbers, there's descriptions and other optional fields that manufacturers are not filling in, and we want them, we use them. So the FDA put out an announcement and said, you know what, it's so important that this data be correct and it be comprehensive. We're going to give you another 2 years to 2020 to submit your class 1s, and we would really like you to go back to these class 3s and 2s, update that information, put high quality data in. And when you do submit your class 1s, please make sure it's of high quality. And then COVID hit. So then we had the third date pushed out to 2022. And now, just a week ago, we have this fourth date. And remember, the fourth date is only to the Good ID submission in December. September 24, the other requirements are still in play. And with that, I'm going to stop. Let's take a couple questions, Joe. I think this has been a really good conversation, a lot of good interaction, and I found it very intriguing.
Well, three things. One, thank you. There's a barrage of thank you, Gary. This was great information, well presented, kind of commentary for you. So thank you. Second, this, this is maybe our 140th episode. Very high interaction here, which means you've really hit on something that's relevant, which makes me think that you've got to put on your calendar April 11, 12, and 13. We need you to come back to 10X in San Diego next year, 11, 12, 13. And I'm going to ask you again to pick a date, if you can, for later this month, where we can get to David's question and you can recap, perhaps in 10 minutes, what folks who might not have joined us today missed at the highest level. And then we can cover the rest of the topic. How does that sound for you?
Yeah, sure. I did a quick look. It looks like the 12th is wide open with me, August 12th, and the 19th is also open. So
let's do the 12th.
All right, 12th it is.
Okay, we'll be back on the 12th. And David, if you want to squeeze in your That'll be the last one for
Yeah, it
today.
was good. And thank you for that, Gary. Great talk. Thank you, Joe, for getting this together. I deal a lot with counterfeit certificates, a lot. I mean, it comes up, and I want to go places to check things out because we have some suspicion, of a counterfeit certificate as an example. And I was just curious about how, what's the counterfeit world look like in UDI? And is that also another reason maybe to get in some global database in order to, confirm, your product, as an example?
Yeah, remember that about second from the bottom, the FDA listed a number of goals for adopting UDI. And one of those was it's very thing that you're talking about, decrease counterfeits and so on, and having a place where I could go, anyone could go and look at the device identifier. So being devious, trying to think about how I would counterfeit, it would make sense not to come up with an incorrect identifier. And I might make the mistake of there's something called a check digit, and I might not create a proper check digit on my device identifier. So that would be a glaring error. So if you're looking for some type of surveillance algorithm, that's one thing that I would check right up front, see if there's a check digit error. And then secondly, I would go to this global database and at least find that this particular number has been recorded and properly approved by the FDA. And then thirdly, it becomes an issue if your number is not up there. It's highly suspect that this is not a legitimate product. But then think about what we talked about earlier. If you're exempt and you did not put your DI in there, now the surveillance kind of doesn't have any verification tool. So all those reasons we talked about voluntarily submitting, let's add counterfeiting to that list as well. So really good point. All right, so I'll quickly summarize. We went through tons of aspects. We recapped what the requirements are for the FDA regarding unique device identification. For those companies starting up new products or introducing a new model or version, make sure that is on your checkbox. I would advise making sure you include that conversation with your product managers, have them know that it needs to show up on the label. There's a number of attributes that we talked about. In some cases, it takes months and months to collect all that data if you have thousands of records. So even if you had pushed off your class 1 reporting, we have found that if you have a couple thousand records, you're going to need a couple months, and time is of the essence here. If you have tens of thousands of records, you better grab an army to try to meet the December date, because this is going to be really, really difficult. We do have some tools to help you, work your way through that, educate your team, and collect the data in a structured fashion. And we're able to actually submit that data electronically at a push of a button. So the collection and cleansing process takes months, probably 80% of the time and effort. The actual submission is relatively simple. But the other thing that we touched on is that class 1s have a lot of nuances. The FDA rolled out a lot of exceptions, and talk to some regulatory savvy person that knows what's going on here to help guide you through. You can work it out on your own, but again, time is the essence here. You need to talk to those people that can help look at your portfolio and point to where you can do things and where you can automate this, make it a little bit easier. Because I was proven wrong. I didn't think this third date was going to be shifted, but we're now in December, about 4 months out. So, move forward, and, we'd be glad to help you. I will mention that you can, I don't want to make this commercial, but if you're really looking for help, you can go to our website. We have some resources. If you have questions, please contact us here, and we'll help you work your way through this UDI forest of
Don't give us those nonsense numbers. They want you, Gary, saying they don't want to go to customer service or some nonsense like that.
Yeah, feel free to grab me. You have my email there.
I do. Is it G
Okay, cool.
at
retech.com. You got it, buddy.
G Sainer at. And you're such a machine that you outlasted my computer battery. I had to switch power sources to keep up with you. Gary Sainer, ladies and gentlemen, he'll be back 2 weeks from today. Thanks everyone for joining, and for you diehards who stuck out until the end. Everything will be recorded and available. Gary, go ahead and send me your slides, as a number have already requested them.
All right, very good. We'll see you in a few weeks. I'll send this package over to you.
Thank you. Stay cool.
All right, take care.
Bye, everyone.
Had a great time. Bye now.
Bye.